Welcome. This is Lisa Cukier, and we're delighted to have you here with us for the Business of Family. This is the 5th episode of our presentation. Today we'll be discussing protecting family governance and an evolving economy. I'm here with two guests, Jillian Mcgrath and Breana, both from Bernstein Alliance, the Wealth Management Group. And we're going to be discussing issues that relate to family governance, some of the paradigms and values that help families in wealth transfer to the next generation, and some of the pitfalls and issues that can come up. We have now been here in the pandemic for an hour. We're seeing for a year rather. We're seeing the rollout of the vaccine, and people are wondering to what extent are they really going to re-engage in the world again, and have there been some benefits and silver linings that will allow us to do things differently? All of us have made adaptations, pandemic adaptations, and a lot of those are going to hold going forward. But in the middle of all of this pandemic, we saw an uptick in divorce. We saw difficulties in relationship because people just don't have the same outlets for the multi-area enrichment, the multifaceted enrichment in life that they used to have. So we're going to be presenting about that. I'm Lisa Cukier. I'm here with Burns & Levinson. Burns & Levinson is a full-service firm. We have practices in multiple different areas, one of which is the private client group area. We have divorce practices and trust and estates, fiduciary litigation, but the rest of our firm is very full service as well, including corporate law, both transactional and litigation, and IP law, both transactional and litigation, and real estate law. One of the articles that I saw in the BBJ, the Boston Business Journal last week, was interesting, and I have one quote from it that I think really sets the stage for the presentation that you're going to hear today from me and Jillian Mcgrath and Breana. It says, with family businesses representing 5.5 million US businesses and 85% of the world's companies, the insights on decoding family dynamics, navigating tricky transitions like marriages and divorces, managing conflicts fraught with emotion are must-reads. In other words, we need to have the wealth managers come together and advise family offices about how to read the room, the family governance room, how to understand with insight, scouting, intuition, and skill, the conversations that need to happen from generation to generation so that we can be sure that wealth transfer happens in an orderly and predictable way, and that conflict is accommodated. To the extent that that might require some legal strategies, we'll be discussing that as well. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce Jillian Mcgrath first, and then Breana. Jillian, please tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Lisa. I speak for both myself and Breana in saying we're thrilled to be here and to be part of this dialogue and conversation today. Like Breana, I am a financial advisor at Bernstein, where we invest money for high net worth individuals and families. And I think this particular conversation is so important because money can tear families apart, right? But wealth, when managed well with the right support from a team of advisors and practitioners, can bring families together and keep them together. And so for me, I've been doing this for 15 years because of the joy I get in being able to advise families on how to keep relationships and wealth as it transfers down through generations strong, and to keep the family intact, and to see joy, really brought to the lives of the families that we work with. We all need a purpose in life. And I think very much that's the work that brings a lot of satisfaction to me and to my colleagues.
Great. Thank you. Couldn't agree with you more, Jillian. And I have another hat in addition to the work that I do with my clients as their financial advisor. I also wear a hat as I'm married into the 5th generation of a large family company, and I'm currently serving as chair to our family counsel. So I also have some personal experience with governing a family enterprise with about 200 family members. And I think it's probably the work that I do with Alliance Bernstein, similar to Jillian's, that got me heavily recruited to wear that hat as the governance structure on, or as the chair of our family council. So I'm really excited about this conversation. It's something that's deeply meaningful to me, both with the work that we do with clients as well as the work with our family. And I've seen it both ways. If done well, it can be a really powerful. If you have good advice, it can be very powerful. And if it's not done well, it can be really, really detrimental. So I'm really excited about this conversation today. Thank you, Lisa, so much for having us. And I hope it's beneficial for all of you.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here. Families are spending so much time together these days as a result of COVID and the quarantines. And there have also been some near lockdowns and back out. And right now we're looking at the governor deciding which restaurants to open and which facilities to open. And Boston is moving a little bit slower than the rest of the state due to some densities, such as in the North End, for example. But how are you managing this with your clients? They're spending so much time together. How are you dealing with the conversations that your clients need to have about having this time together and preserving wealth?
Yeah, I'll start, Bree, and then hand it over to you. This has been a trying time for, honestly, I think everyone. As you said at the outset, Lisa, we don't have the same outlets that we had before, and it's been a challenge, I think, from a mental health standpoint for individuals and for families more broadly. As Bree and I work with our clients, we found families that have done a good job pivoting to the online virtual platform for communicating and staying in touch with each other. Particularly when there's a family business involved, that's even more important. But, just to maintain that contact, fortunately, there seems to be a light at the end of the tunnel. But what we encourage our clients to do is to just keep communication open. As we're working with them through purposefulness and discussion of values, there are really 4 activities that we encourage before we can even start talking about, the tools in the practitioner's toolkit. Right. So we think through a shared family purpose and legacy, a set of values and beliefs that can inspire the next generation, creating a forum for communication among family members, which again is incredibly important, particularly in this COVID environment, and then a well-defined plan to educate and prepare future heirs. Right. So that's a lot of work that we do with families before we even start talking about what types of trusts we're going to set up, and working with other practitioners in doing that. It's really taking a step back to define what the family is trying to achieve and setting up mechanisms for them to achieve that.
Bree, what's happening with governance, family governance, and resilience of the family office right now?
Yeah, I think some of the things, there's obviously challenges in not being able to see each other in person, but we've really tried to focus on the positives. What are the opportunities in this environment that we can really take advantage of? And one of the issues that I think large family enterprise have is, how do you dispel information down to the family that's a one size fits all? If you have people in the room that are 20 to 70 years old, that's a big range that you're trying to reach. And so one of the things that we've been doing is trying to take advantage of the virtual environment to be more targeted. Let's set up opportunities to have conversations with your 20-year-olds, with your 30-year-olds, whatever the right demographics might be, to really facilitate something that's a little bit more meaningful and have some of the conversations that Jillian and I will get into. But the conversations we're having with wealth with 20-year-olds is very, very different than those that we're having with 70-year-olds. And so certainly there's been challenges, but I think this environment has allowed us to be a little bit more nimble with the use of technology, which I think is an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm sure that the 70-year-olds very much want you to have conversations about stewardship with those in the 20-year-old range. So Jillian, tell us about that. How do you bring up and discuss with your clients purposefulness and values like stewardship of wealth?
Yeah, it's not always an easy conversation to start. Every family is different, and every family's willingness to expose details of wealth or to engage in conversation with future generations or heirs is different. So, we start by taking a very customized approach to working with a family, understanding what they're looking to achieve, helping them to pull out some of the values and the ideals that they would like to be passed down. And then, we have a whole set of programs that that we have formulated as an organization to work with and educate future leaders of the family. And this can be done whether they know the full value of the wealth of the family or whether they know absolutely nothing about the level of wealth of the family. Either way, at some point in their lives, they're going to be responsible for making decisions and passing the torch on to their children and keeping the family value and vision alive. And so helping them understand early how they can better understand what investing means, the benefit of compound return. And we can do that from a very early age where we're talking about lemonade stands and starting a business and what profits are, to a much more advanced degree where we're talking really about stocks 101, bonds 101, the makeup of a modern day asset allocation. And we sprinkle in there other tools that we see, might be beneficial. One is an app that parents can sign up for. And so for the really young children, it allows them in an electronic manner to manage allowance. So when the children clean the room or make their bed or whatever the family has decided that those tasks to be performed are, the parent can transfer, because most children have iPhones these days or some sort of electronic device, can transfer funds into the bank account. They come with a little debit card so they can go buy candy or whatever it is they want. But the parents can actually dictate that, I'm going to pay 5% on any money that you save and don't spend immediately. Right. And so it sort of starts teaching a young child about the value of saving and earning and really of the dollar earned. So there are a number of ways we can do it. We could talk for hours on it. But I think those are some of the high level places where we spend our time.
Yeah. And I just want to add in, I love that example with the app, Jillian. And another one that I really encourage families to do is along the same lines is give your children a little bit of money to take ownership of. So whether you're using your $15,000 per year annual exclusions to start a small account for them, and then have your financial professionals actually have conversations with them on that money. Have them have little review meetings. Why are you allocated this way? How did it perform this year? Do you want to make an asset allocation change? And the purpose for this is not to say you're going to inherit X amount of money. It's just to start getting them comfortable with the conversation, because at some point they are going to need to be stewards of this money. And if they don't even know how to speak the language, it's going to be nearly impossible. And I'll tell you one really quick story. So I have a client with whom we've been doing this. I have a 21-year-old daughter, and she emails me a couple of weeks ago and says, I was on TikTok and there was a financial advisor on there talking about the value of a Roth IRA. Should I do a Roth IRA? And I'm just jumping up and down in my seat saying, yes, this is exactly the kind of engagement we want to see with our 21-year-olds. And it's just a great way to open the door. And I think having some skin in the game makes them a lot more open to that. And Lisa, I want to ask you, because COVID certainly has impacted our world, but surprising to many, a lot of our clients are actually a little bit better off at the end of 2020 than they were at the beginning. But I have a feeling that's not necessarily the same with marriages. So what are you seeing as far as how COVID has impacted your clients?
Yeah, so the marriage has been really pressed upon. It's been very difficult. There's many forces that press on a marriage, but the COVID issue, having people all be in the same house all the time, unable to celebrate the holidays with extended family, unable to go into the office with ease, unable to go out with friends and out to theaters and symphony and sports events. It's been very difficult, and it really has pressed on marriage and been very difficult. It's created a lot of divorce. I've had a lot of people call me from their car, sometimes with masks on their faces or right underneath their chins, saying, I really need help. I used to do a lot of, and still do a lot of pre-divorce strategic planning with families, whether they were families of wealth or enterprising families, figuring out ways that if worse came to worse, these were in pre-troubled marriages where already there were problems, sometimes for years, and we would work together to figure out what strategies to put into place long in advance, whether we need to change some trust and estate documents or think about some postnuptial planning or make any changes in income structures and even structures related to who performs caregiving functions for the children. And we would discuss this in advance. And some of these clients I have been representing for years while they've been trying to keep their marriage in place and trying to work on the marriage in therapy, but I'm taking the legal steps that are needed at the same time, just in case. And what happened was once people went into shelter during COVID, a lot of them said, this has been it. The marriage cannot survive this anymore. And the divorce it's happening. So I'm handling a lot of those divorces. Another thing that happened was in the alimony situation where people did come back for post-divorce alimony modifications, claiming need or durational limit issues. So it's been very, very active. I've had more than ever postnuptials to be working on with clients, not enough prenuptials. I think a lot of people got married very quickly in the backyard without thinking, oh, they canceled their big wedding and they hadn't thought maybe they need to think about prenuptial planning. They just went right away and had a small wedding in the backyard. So I'm doing postnuptial planning now to assist families who didn't do the prenuptial planning because they thought we'll just have a quick little family backyard wedding and have the ceremony later, not realizing that they might have forgotten about the prenuptial agreement. But one of the things that ties together the different conversations that we've had so far, where you're discussing the education of the next generation and the forces that press on marriage. It also, I'm going to put Bree right on the spot here. It strikes me that some of the conversations that we have with our children are different qualitatively than some of the conversations that we have with spouses who come into a family. And the reason I'm picking on you is because here you have come into a family that has 5 generations of it, and you're working together, you're on the family council. But I wonder, I see as a lawyer, sometimes a tendency towards black box when it comes to the in-laws, a tendency to not disclose. And so here, we're talking about disclosure and acculturating the family to be ready to have the conversations about wealth. And at the same time, there's a countervailing force, which is don't disclose to the spouses. So Bree, tell us about your experience, but also how you advise other families along these lines.
Yeah, thank you. And this is probably one of the conversations that comes up the most whenever I'm in a family business setting is how to handle in-laws, or sometimes we're affectionately called outlaws. But yeah, it's interesting. I think my husband's family has been very inclusive of in-laws. And I think that they've realized, and maybe this wasn't the case during the first, second, third generation, but they've realized that in-laws can be incredible resources to the family. We bring skill sets that are differentiated than the nuclear family. And when you get as big as our family is, you need as many resources and skill sets as you possibly can to keep the governance structure alive. It's a lot of work to keep a good governance structure moving forward. And I just think it's also a human element. I mean, nobody wants to feel like an outsider. Nobody wants to feel like things aren't being disclosed. And actually, Lisa, we'll have you talk about the actual requirement to disclose, because there's some of this that's just not even up for negotiation if you want to do proper planning. But I would say the first thing is have the proper planning in place, right? Spouses don't have to be so scary if your estate plan is up to date, if you have the prenuptials that Lisa's referring to. So get the legal structure in place. But then with any of this governance, present values in a way that you want to carry forward, right? And so if you want to values of inclusion and acceptance and all those kinds of feelings, it just makes the people involved feel much better. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but if something were to happen between my husband and I, and we're very fortunately very happily married at this point, but if his family was not inclusionary of me and we were to ever get divorced, I feel like my sentiment towards them would be very different. Whereas if something were to happen to us, I would want to stay involved with his family because I love them. And I think that creates a much better outcome in a divorce situation. And so I often just tell people to think about it from that perspective too. It's not just about the money, it's about the values and the human element that I think can be really powerful.
Can I just add two quick thoughts in there? We did a webcast yesterday, actually, with Mitzi Purdue, who comes from two very successful long lines of family business. On her side, the Sheraton hotels, and she married into the Purdue Farms family. And one of the things that they do, which I just loved, and I think it speaks, to what Bree just mentioned, they create essentially a welcome to the family package for all new spouses who are marrying into the family. And in that package contains a history of the family, Frank Purdue's ethical will, so they understand the values, the sacrifices, and the hard work that created this wealth that exists for the family, how the family views that wealth. I just thought it was such a wonderful gesture of truly welcoming new spouses into the family. And her point was, without spouses, the family doesn't go on. And we want the family to go on. And so they play a very important role in raising our next generations. And then the other thought that I would add is that we focus so much on the prenup, and Lisa, I know Bree and I both want to hear how you think about that, because that process in and of itself can be interesting for families. A lot of the work that we'll do with new couples is on the backside of that. So maybe in accordance with the prenup or as they're developing it, but sitting down the newly married or to be married couple and going through a values exercise where we have a whole set of cards where each new partner to this relationship identifies the values that matter the most to them and the values that matter the least to them of this set of cards. And we go through a conversation with them over why they chose certain values, where those thoughts come from, to help them get on the same page, right? So that it's not a I, me, my family, you, your family. It's an us. We're creating a new family. And so how do we understand where the other is coming from as it pertains to our value system and our thoughts around wealth? And how can we get on the same page and just understand each other better? And we found it's been a fantastic activity for getting new couples on the same page and encouraging a mutual understanding of each other.
This is very helpful. And there's one term that you used, and I do understand what you mean, but I don't know that everybody who's listening understands it. So can you explain what an ethical will is? Because that's a very important concept, and I want to make sure everybody's clear on that.
Absolutely. It's a great point. It's not something that comes up in every meeting where a trust and estate plan is being created. It is certainly something that we encourage our clients to think about. It's not legally binding. So it's not the will that you're creating that dictates how your assets are passing down to your heirs. It's much more of a living, breathing document that memorializes who you are and what your value system is, and reminds heirs again of the sort of hard work and sacrifices that were taken to create this wealth. And it can be in any form. It could be, you hope that it's memorialized in some way that's easy for heirs to access, but it could be an autobiography. It could be a plaque with just the top 10 values that you and whoever else in your family is making these decisions have determined are most important and you want to remind your heirs of. It could be an email. It could really take a whole host of different forms, but the goal is that it's not just about passing down money. It's about passing down values and priorities.
I have a client who has a lot of values and priorities that have been passed down to the generations for years. And we were actually joking around during one of our client lawyer Zooms about acculturating the next generation to be ready to deal with prenuptial agreements. And yes, there's a lot of that conversation going on. But what happens, I find, is that when it's time for the next generation to be thinking about marital planning and prenuptial planning, what comes up and what came up in this particular family was, well, don't you trust me? Don't you trust my choice? So Jillian, tell us a little bit more about how you have this conversation about wealth transfer, prenuptial planning, when you are dealing with the competing values. You've got the older generation thinking about stewardship, And you've got the younger generation thinking about trust, as in, don't you trust me? And you know the reality of it. So how do you advise families through that tricky competing value conversation?
Yeah, it's not easy because, no two families are the same. This is certainly something that comes up. The prenup it's a bit of an awkward conversation to have with, a new potential spouse or partner. It could make a child, to your point, feel like their parents don't trust them in terms of who they're deciding to choose as their life partner, and instead want to put restrictions around that. We encourage our families to have honest, open communication about it, to sit down and to really talk about it, and to talk about, what happens when these mechanisms aren't in place and something does go wrong with the marriage, because none of us predict that our marriage is going to end when we're getting married, right? We're so happy, we're in love, we're going to spend the rest of our life with this person. But Lisa, as you know, what is it? 50% of marriages end in divorce. I mean, staggering statistics.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think it's so important to, not just demand and dictate, but to educate.
Yes. And Bree, in terms of family governance and passing this message along, what do you experience, and how do you guide enterprising families and families of wealth to open their eyes to this? And how do you have those difficult conversations, especially in a place like New England, where discussion of the actual values of family wealth is pretty hush-hush, more so than other locations?
Yeah, it's a good question. And within our family, but I think all of this applies to my clients as well, is within our family, so we don't actually have a family office because we have an operating company still. And so each individual family manages their own finances, which is a little bit of a risk, right? Because if there are elements of individual families that aren't doing the planning properly, that could be a little bit of a risk. And so we want to make sure that we're talking about it. But I think, as Jillian alluded to, transparency is really important. Don't spring the idea of a prenup on your child when they're 10 days away out from getting married. They should be having this conversation, I would argue, years in advance. And you should be having it with the spouse, as early as is reasonable. And that was, I think, one of the ways, and I alluded to this, have your legal structures in place so that it's very clear to the spouse what their expectations are. So for example, in my husband's company, shares only pass down through bloodline. I will never own shares. I have zero expectation that I would ever own shares. It's not why I married my husband. And so, but that was very openly communicated to me, and there's no surprises there. But I think that if something became a surprise, again, it's the human element. How would you want to be treated in these kinds of situations? And so I guess that's always my recommendation. And I think it is with so many issues, whether it's divorce or not, it's just good communication and making people feel included, I think, can get around a lot of this. And quite frankly, when it was communicated to me, prenups fit into a much larger estate plan, right? So without an estate plan, or without a prenup, there was elements of their larger estate plan that didn't work very well. And so that made a lot of sense to me when explained that way. And so, and I don't know, maybe it's easier to receive this information when you understand some of it, which brings me back to our first point. You have to have children. And mind you, a lot of kids are getting married in their late 20s, early 30s. I mean, these are early conversations you have to start having, because they're not going to understand the implications of these factors if they don't understand the language that you're talking to them in. But Lisa, I think one of the things that surprised me when I was in my 20s and learning about all this is the disclosure requirements around prenups. Jillian, you and I, like in the financial advising, we can kind of tiptoe around it, right? We can ease our way into the conversation about how much money they're going to inherit. But when it comes to prenup, it's a pretty blunt situation. So I would be really curious as to how you're handling that conversation, because it's, it's something that happens early and pretty bluntly. So.
That is the biggest showstopper for a lot of families in terms of having a prenup. A lot of families want their children naturally to have a fire in their belly and to be very motivated to work hard. And they don't want to discuss the actual values of family wealth. They don't want their children to think, oh, money grows on trees because it's all there and I don't have to work hard. There's lots of maxims and different proverbs that people use to describe their interest in making sure that the next generation can be self-sustaining, self-supporting, and stewards of wealth. So a prenuptial needs to have a full and fair disclosure. And the reason, in a nutshell, is because the incoming spouse needs to know what they're giving up in order for that waiver to be meaningful. You need to know what you're waiving or giving up in order to give it up. You can't just say, I promise to give up whatever wealth my family has, that my fiance's family has. That doesn't do it. You need to identify in detail the different assets, the different types of assets, the nature of them, the values of them, expectancy. However, and this is the big however, and this is where there's nuance and strategy. When I put together a disclosure form, I am very careful to give as little information as I can beyond what absolutely has to be told. And so I might discuss the fact that presently it is impossible to value a trust because perhaps the class of beneficiaries is still open. But suffice it to say, the individual is one of 5 beneficiaries, or the class will close upon the death of so-and-so. So there's a way to be clear and definite without giving it all away. The idea, the real nuance here, the trick, and this is why there needs to be both experienced divorce counsel and experienced trust and estate counsel working collaboratively from different angles, looking at a prenuptial agreement, is because ultimately, if a prenuptial agreement is attacked in the context of divorce and the outgoing spouse, who's not part of the family and not part of the enterprise, says, I didn't know what I was waiving at the time. I didn't know how much money there really was. If I'd known that, I wouldn't have signed it. The disclosure is not complete. Then that could take down and make unenforceable that prenuptial agreement. And as you pointed out so correctly, Bree, the prenup is not only about divorce, it's also about estates. And part of the work that I do relates to representing particular families in connection with litigation and controversy or dispute that arises in blended families, where you have people who are remarrying, and there are prenuptial agreements in the new marriage. There's existing estate planning. There may be a separation agreement, which is the divorce agreement, the divorce settlement from the prior marriage. There may be children from a prior marriage. There may be children and grandchildren in a new marriage. And before you know it, you have a blended family potential nightmare where there could be a lot of reasons why there's rivalries and intra-family conflicts, but having a prenuptial agreement that resolves that issue is huge. People don't think of prenuptial agreements as being a game changer in terms of resolving intra-family dispute that relates to blended family issues that are so normal. But back to the question you asked is, how do I deal with the keeping of information private? I have some absolute strategies for that, one of which is I don't necessarily share the trusts, your family trusts, with the other side. If I'm asked for them, I can have a non-disclosure agreement executed or a confidentiality agreement executed, and I can require that the trust go to the other side, to counsel on the other side for 24 hours and back to me. I can, I have different ways of managing that issue so that proprietary information is never disclosed and confidential information is deleted completely without any electronic copies made. And there's ways that we can do that. So I do look after families in that very way when there's complex, sophisticated, or significant assets. Yeah. How do you encourage people to communicate through that issue of not wanting to share information with the next generation and starting the conversation? Because in order to be stewards, there needs to be some conversation about what there is and what needs to be passed along.
Do you want to take that?
Sure. I'm a firm believer that disclosure is not necessarily something that's going to disincentivize the next generation. I think that so much more of that is about the way that you communicate about money and the values that you instill in your family. And what I mean by that is, first of all, most children know that their families have money. I mean, they're not, I mean, unless it's an extreme scenario where the parents are really living a life that is counter to their wealth, they're not immune to the situation. So by being at least somewhat upfront, I think that doesn't necessarily disincentivize having that fire in your belly like you spoke about, Lisa. And so I think it's just really important that if you're going to talk about money with your kids, you place it properly into the bigger picture, right? So what I often will say something like, you have the benefit of this wealth, but it also comes with some responsibility. And let's talk about what that responsibility actually looks like, right? You don't get to just have, the nice vacations and the nice house and some security in your life and the choice to do things that a career that you might want to do because of passion versus financial decisions. But it comes, you have to be a steward of this money. It's upon you to learn enough and be well educated enough to make informed decisions. You don't need to be the expert. It's good to hire professionals, right? I mean, Jillian and myself and you, Lisa, play a really important role, but you need to be educated enough to be able to hire the right professionals and to be able to understand what the professionals are telling you. And ultimately, you'll be a decision maker. So I think in addition to some of the specific tools that Jillian and I talked about at the beginning, I think just making sure that you really put it in context of the bigger picture is really helpful. We also have some fun exercises that we can do too. We have one called money messages, so where we talk about how is money communicated to you as a child, right? So there's all sorts of different sayings. Money doesn't grow on trees, or there's lots of them out there, and they have impact, right? That affects individuals in a certain way. And how did that make you feel as a kid? And is that the kind of impact that you want to have on your children? And maybe you want to change the way that you speak about money so that it's a little bit more productive. So those are some of the tools that I use with clients.
If I could just add one, and Breana and I use this approach a lot with the families that we work with, but is engaging in philanthropy at a younger age, because it's not disseminating that you're going to inherit $50-100 million and, therefore your life is, is changed vis-a-vis what you thought. It's much more about, look, as Bree said, we're in a fortunate position, and we are instilling in you, the value of being able to give back because of your fortunate position. And so, one exercise that has worked really well for a couple families that we've done it with is to create a family charitable vehicle. So maybe it's a donor advised fund, maybe it's a private foundation or a charitable trust. That money is endowed to go to charity. So, there's no I, me out of this scenario. It's much more of a natural we. And every year at Thanksgiving, they make their decisions around what gifts they're going to make to nonprofits. And every family member comes with 2 nonprofits that they want to support and why it matters. And at the end of the day, at the very least, other than giving funds away to nonprofits and needy causes, the family learns more about each other and about what they're doing with their lives and what they care about when they're not together. And so we have found that to be a wonderful tool for fostering communication.
It's very important, and it's important now as we're coming up on Passover and Easter. Maybe that conversation should be had, especially now as we're coming into the spring and having the ability to think outside of the home and more about philanthropy and assisting people outside of our own families. One of the things that we discussed in our preliminary planning session, and a term that you used, Jillian, was you, as well as you, Bree, you talked about the cost of conservatism in the way that we're dealing with planning. And I know that the three of us work with all different families, but we also happen to work with a lot of enterprising women. I note that in the BBJ, the Boston Business Journal, the list for the largest women-owned businesses in Massachusetts just came out just a week or two ago, and it lists 36 businesses that are very significant. These are women-owned businesses, and I looked through the list to see whether there were men and women owning these businesses, but no, these are mostly 100% women-owned, and revenue of these business, the first one starts at over $400 million per year, very significant business. I also looked at the sectors, the industry sectors, thinking that maybe these were businesses that were traditionally and stereotypically women type businesses, but not so. This is heavy construction. This is real estate. These are businesses that tend to be traditionally businesses that you might associate men in. So here we have a whole shift that has occurred through the years when we weren't watching. And now that we're having these conversations about enterprising families and recognizing that some of that wealth in family business and family office comes in through women CEOs and women owners, I am concerned a little bit about the cost of conservatism and the way that that might disproportionately impact women over men. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's something that is, first of all, those statistics are fantastic. Love to see that. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. We work with some of the most successful females. It's humbling, just fantastic women. But one of the challenges that women face, whether they're running a business or they've inherited wealth, but women decision makers, as it pertains to family and accumulated wealth, is that women tend to be under allocated to stocks. So when we think about an allocation, you have, your traditional allocation is going to be comprised of stocks, bonds, and maybe some alternative investments like private equity, VC, et cetera. Your stocks are really going to be your engine for growth. And as many who have invested in the stock market realize and recognize, that's going to come with a good deal of volatility. You're going to experience ups and downs, last year being a great example of both. But what we found is that women actually tend to be under allocated to stocks, vis-a-vis their male counterparts. And there are a number of research studies that have brought these results to light. But why it matters is that engine for growth over time is really what's going to build wealth, whether it's significant wealth or it's enough for you to survive through your retirement. Women live longer than men. And so in actuality, we should be taking on a bit more risk to grow those assets to provide for a longer lifetime. And so by being more conservative, we actually put ourselves in a position where, in certain instances, we might be at risk of running out of money if we live well into our 90s, which statistically is very well could happen. And so, that's something that we do a lot of educating, and speaking with our clients about, just to recognize this, and the impact that it can have on a portfolio or a family's wealth over time.
Yeah, and I just want to add a few things onto what Jillian said. So one, women definitely tend to be more risk averse women tend to be more risk averse than men, but I see this with men a lot too. But with a lot of the families that we're all advising, we're really talking about multi-generational wealth. So most of this money isn't even for you. And so I would make the argument that by being too conservative in some instances, you're actually not even being a good steward of money, right? Just because you're 70 does not mean that you need to be conservative if 80% of your money is getting passed on to the next generation, right? I mean, the time horizon for that money isn't yours. It's yours plus your kids, often the grandkids. And so a lot of the work that Jillian and I do is really spending time up front, understanding the use of each bucket of money. Because if we can separate that a little bit, of course, we don't want somebody to be have too much volatility, especially for short-term spending needs. What do you need in the next 2 years? Let's make sure that that's incredibly conservative. What do you need for your lifetime? That should be something more moderate. What's really going on to the next gen, to philanthropy? That should be much more growth oriented. And this conversation is so much more important now because of interest rates. The cost of conservatism today is much higher than it has been in the past. I mean, cash is earning 0. Even high quality bonds that are the protective part of most clients' asset allocations are paying 1%. I mean, that's not keeping up with inflation. This is a really, really important conversation that clients need to be having with their advisors, and it might be worth relooking at it, because we want to make sure that we truly are being the proper stewards of this capital, and that we're keeping all beneficiaries in mind when making these kinds of decisions.
Yeah, very important. It also really impacts trust and estate planning as well, and the philanthropic issues that are related in creating foundations. But also, I understand you're helping families to understand the reality of the assets so that they won't feel so conservative, even though it must be just an awesome responsibility that your clients have. You know, they want to be stewards for the next generation, and you know that they're sufficient for now. And they're thinking, what about the future? Their family has told them since they were little that this is their responsibility to protect others who are not even potentially born yet. So it's an awesome responsibility, but one that I hear you having the conversations about in a very careful way, especially given the economy right now. I think we were all a little stunned to see what happened in the economy. I think we initially thought we'd see a more bleak picture than it actually is. Also, the pandemic brought us in 2020, the CARES Act and other opportunities for getting good tax efficient benefit out of different philanthropic efforts. So it turned out better. But I recognize the need for advising families away from that conservatism that might impact them. Let me change the conversation a little bit now to a different area of wealth management and law, and that protection of family wealth. Some families are managing very compromising situations, especially during the pandemic. We've got families who are dealing with diminished capacity of some of the older members of the family, or families dealing with illness, some of them dealing with mental illness concerns, or children who have special needs, or family members who have addiction issues, or who may have spending problems, and different types of exposures of family wealth. How do you manage that within the family?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly. So first of all, I think it's really important that people are being really transparent with their advisors, because we can be really good identifiers of when something's going wrong. I think Jillian and I probably are on the front lines of this a lot. Attorneys play a critical role in the advice piece, but I don't know that unless you're doing some planning in that moment, you probably don't have as constant of interaction with your attorneys as you might with your financial advisors. And so we come across this a ton. So first of all, be upfront. Make sure that your advisors know what's going on with your family, so that we can be paying attention to something that might seem outside of the box, right? If we're getting a call from a child all of a sudden that seem irregular or out of the blue, a lot of times with my widowed clients, I want to know who in their family I should contact if I suspect something, if they're starting to experience diminished capacity. But I need to be having that conversation with them well in advance of when that happens. Again, it's your state documents that are going to govern what actually happens, but at least I have a contact that I can reach out to and say, I've gotten a couple phone calls from your mom in the last few weeks that are concerning to me. What's going on? I'm not going to tell this child how much money you have. I legally can't do that, but at least I know who to reach out to. So that's a few things that we can do, but you also have to remember that at the end of the day, particularly if there's money in somebody's name outright, if they tell us to do something, we're pretty I mean, we have to do it. I mean, we can advise against it. We can have conversations. We can try to, but at the end of the day, if somebody's telling us to do something, we have to do it. So this gets back to making sure you have good estate planning. And this often, sometimes clients don't actually fund their trusts, things like that. And it's not just about after you're dead. A lot of this can have really important roles while you're still living.
Yeah, and I would just add, I have come from a family of healthcare practitioners, and I was having a conversation with my uncle, who's a primary care physician in the UK. And he brought up a good point, something that I hadn't spent a lot of time thinking about, but that is really unfortunate. For a lot of these degenerative diseases, one of the first symptoms that emerges is an inability to conceptualize money and assets. And so spending patterns change. And, he's been in situations where his patients have started to develop symptoms. And before it's diagnosed and the family has a handle on it, a significant portion of the assets are gone. And so, I would just reiterate a lot of what Bree said, but bring it back to you, Lisa. This is why it's so important to have these documents in place and to have the protective measures. We instituted a policy with all of our new account opening documents, as Bree mentioned, where clients are asked to identify a trusted contact. So in the event that we get a request that sounds strange, or we're seeing a pattern of behaviors that is irregular, we can go to that trusted contact and we have that in writing. I was so thrilled when we put that in place. But one of the things that we routinely do is escalate very quickly to the legal advisor. And so I'd love to hear how you handle these situations, once they get to you.
Sure. I had a very unfortunate situation that ended okay. A client's father had sold the family business and the real estate that it sat on because he was duped. And he felt that he was going to incur he was not conceptualizing the issues properly, just as your uncle has identified is what happens. He had lost the capacity to really conceptualize where risk was. And he thought that he had such a significant tax risk that he went and sold the business thinking there was no other opportunity. And we ultimately got value, the better value for the business, because he sold it for a song, not realizing, and the real estate too. But in connection with my understanding what was going on, I was able to get more value back for the business and really approximate what the true value was. So that's one thing to do. The documents, having those documents in place is very important, without a doubt. And I'll go through some of the different documents that can help in that situation that are very power boosted if you can anticipate some of this. But I do want to mention that even if there's supposed to be a distribution from a trust, or if somebody has withdrawal rights, and that person who's about to receive money, whether because the distribution is going to be made or that person is exercising their withdrawal rights under a trust, if there is reason to believe that that individual lacks capacity to manage those assets properly, or if those assets are going to be at risk, there are steps that can be taken through the filing of a conservatorship action or through exercise under a power of attorney in order to block that sort of thing, or to divert it, or to delay it. And that way, before the harm happens, there is a way to manage it. I can't tell you how many times I have petitioned for conservatorship just for the appointment of an emergency temporary conservator, just to step in, receive the distribution, and from there distribute it in fragments, in safe fragments, so that the individual's needs are met, they're feeling comfortable, but there's not a lot of slippage of significant asset that may be coming out in the way of a otherwise uncontrolled distribution. So that's one way to do it. Another is that if families have reason to believe that there is a family member who could potentially have a manic episode or a gambling situation or an addiction or drug-influenced compromising situation that compromises family assets and wealth, then we would draft what I think of as a power-boosted healthcare proxy and power of attorney long before any problem ever happens. It requires the conversations that you're talking about, that you have with families about these compromising situations that happen in all families. No need for shame. This happens in every family to some extent. Every family has life cycle issues. These are among those issues. So with a power boosted durable power of attorney, for example, we might have FERPA language in there, which is the Federal Education Privacy Act, so that if a person in their 20s is in college and is not doing well, and the university or college says, we're not going to communicate with the parents, then this document will allow the parents to communicate. The document will allow the family to understand what's happening with finances, to intervene, to transact, to take money and divert it from an otherwise unhealthy spending pattern or potentiality. And so with these powers of attorney, there's ways that you can have the right family member step in and act and transact right before the harm happens. Or if it's too late, then to reverse transactions. There are ways that I can disgorge assets that have been wrongfully received by somebody, like gifts and that sort of thing, and to restore assets to the proper instrument or the proper account. So there's ways that that can be done with a power boosted durable power of attorney. A lot of times family members feel like they're in the dark. They don't know what's going on, and their incapacitated family member is not communicating and is not allowing clinicians to communicate with the family. And so the family is left in the dark, not knowing what's going on. So with communication in advance with the person who has a potentially compromising situation, you can have a power boosted healthcare proxy that permits a particular family member to have communications with a clinician in that emergency situation, so that you've got the free-flowing communication at the moment when you need it most. So those are some of the ways that we can use documents very carefully to make sure that we're dealing with some of these issues that come up when families feel like, oh, it's too late, we don't know what to do, we can't get information, and there's no steps we can take. The answer to the question is yes, there are steps that can be taken to resolve a situation like this. What are you seeing in the, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to reiterate something that you brought up, Lisa. It's that, so much of what we've been talking about is communication and early planning, but sometimes that doesn't happen, right? And that doesn't mean it's too late with all of this, right? Whether it's family governance, whether it's relationships within your family. And I actually was just attending a family business event, and I was speaking with a family that has third generation, and they unfortunately just had a big riff with one of their sisters who they're not speaking to. And you could just see how raw that situation was for them and how devastating. And now they're realizing that they really need to do some heavy lifting work on the governance and put some egos aside and realize, just because they're very smart and very good at running a business doesn't necessarily mean that they're experts in how to govern a family. And it's not too late. Every family goes through these things. Every family, doesn't communicate early enough or often enough and needs advice. And so I just want to reiterate that it's while something may happen that's undesirable, it doesn't mean it's too late to fix it going forward.
Jillian, do you have any final thoughts? I see we're getting close to the end of the hour. So do you have any final thoughts on how to assist families going through some of those compromising situations?
Yeah, I would just start by saying, Lisa, you clearly do a wonderful job for your clients. You've put a lot of thought into this, into the ways that, as Bree said, not only pre-planning, but maybe backtrack planning. The opportunity is not missed. Better now than never. I guess the only thing I would add is a lot of people make their estate plans and make the decisions about who their power of attorney and their healthcare proxy is on their own. I would highly encourage you to have that conversation with whoever it is you're assigning those responsibilities to. My parents thought that I would be a good healthcare proxy. Had I not forced that conversation on them, I probably would be in the position of having to make healthcare decisions for them. That's not me. I will leave them on that machine as long as the hospital will keep them, because I'm not going to pull the plug. My siblings, I love them. They love my parents too, but they're going to be a lot less emotional about that decision. And that's who you want. That's who my parents want making that decision. So thankfully, we had that conversation, and I was able to identify an area that I was being given responsibilities that I didn't want, and I didn't feel I would be the best maker of those decisions. So I think it's just another way to reinforce that communication is so critical.
I agree. One of the silver linings, if you will call it that, of the pandemic is that people can be wherever they are, watching presentations like this and learning so much. It used to be that we had to carve out time in our day and take our cars and go someplace in order to sit with experts and hear what you have to say. So I'm thankful that a lot of people can learn about these different tools and techniques and the conversations that you have just sitting wherever they are, whether they're at their homes, in their cars, wherever, at their offices. These are all very important issues. The pandemic left an indelible mark. We thought this was going to be a short pause, but it turned into a longer term issue. And even though vaccines are being rolled out and we're all hopeful that we'll be vaccinated, certainly sometime in May or by July, and that perhaps children will be too. We're anticipating people will be back in offices more so and back in school more so by September of 2021. But the atmospherics have changed, that the situation has changed, and COVID has left an indelible mark on all of us. We will be doing things differently. We have some pandemic adapted habits that we have made along the way, and hopefully they have all fostered ongoing resilience. So with that, I'd like to thank Breana Cole and Jillian Mcgrath, and have you both let everybody who's listening know how to reach you if they want to reach you. So Bree, why don't we start with you? How can people reach you if they have ongoing questions?
Thank you so much, Lisa. It's been a pleasure, and thank you for inviting us. Probably the best way to reach me is via email. So it's breana.cole. My name's up on the screen at bernstein.com. And really any questions, any way I can be a resource, just happy to. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
Jillian.
Thank you. Yes, likewise. Lisa, thank you for having us. I think this was a really important and energizing conversation. My email is jillian.mcgrath@bernstein, BERNSTEIN.com.
Thank you. And I can be reached at 617-966-9582. My email address is lcukier@bernslev.com. That's LCUKIER@BURNSLEV. Thank you for watching Business of Family, the 5th episode. We will see you in April for the 6th episode. Have a good day.